much for coming and for providing this opportunity for me to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing at the Mathematics, Reasoning, and Learning Lab in Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. And you might be thinking, why are we talking about the brain? How can learning about this wet, squishy biological organ tell us anything about the complicated, uniquely human interactions that happen in a classroom? And to begin to answer that question, I'd like to first tell you a bit about how we study the brain during mathematical problem solving. So you may have seen images like this where there's sort of colorful blobs on images of an adult or a child brain, or maybe these really cool 3D renderings. And to create images like this, we actually start with a process called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a type of functional neuroimaging. And it begins with a child who comes to the scanner, and we use the same MRI machine that could take an image of your knee, for example, if you were injured. But instead of the knee, the child actually lies down and we take images of its brain. This coil around their head sends transmissions which are picked up and collected, and that's where we get the signal. But it also has a mirror on it which is related to a projector, and that projector enables the participant to see something on the screen while they're solving problems. And what they might see might look something like this. They could see a math problem, and we can't have them actually say their answer aloud. That would move their head too much for us to get a good picture. So instead, we just give them problems and ask them to say, is this a correct problem or an incorrect problem? And you'll also see that we can compare easy problems where we're just adding one to slightly harder problems where you might have to do a carry operation. And while they're doing these problems, we're measuring these brain signals and we're following where blood is flowing in the brain. And it turns out that the areas of the brain where the neurons are working the hardest are the areas where oxygenated blood is being sent. And the magnetic properties of the oxygenated versus the deoxygenated blood change the signal that's measured by the MRI machine, and that's how we can tell what parts of the brain are working hard. And when we do it, we get these very blurry pictures, but we might get a signal that looks something like this. And we can know that when task A was on the screen, the easy task, we can find that there's smaller responses versus when task B, that harder arithmetic task, was on the screen, we had larger responses. And so we can average together the responses for one task versus another task. And so that when you see an image like this, you're actually seeing a color code of the average activity for one task or another task. And if it's higher, we can say that that part of the brain is working harder for that task. Now, a new innovation that we can do is, instead of looking at two tasks at the same moment, we could actually look at one task before or after learning. And we could see, for example, that after you've received some instruction in a topic, you've increased your activity in a particular part of the brain. And so we can use those changes in brain activity with learning combined with our prior knowledge about what different parts of the brain do to really understand what's happening with learning. And many parts of the brain are involved in math cognition. And today we're going to be focusing primarily on the parietal lobe, which is involved in calculation and number processing. And we'll talk a little bit about the hippocampus, which is an area involved in long-term memory. So perhaps if I were to give you a question like this, you could very easily, I hope, come up with the answer 11. But if you ask a child, they might try one of several different strategies. They could start counting up from the smaller number. They could actually flip them around, knowing that addition is commutative, and then start counting up from the larger number. Or they might break the problem down into easier steps. And finally, they might do what you did, which is retrieve the answer from memory. And so behaviorally, we know that there's a progression from these kinds of strategies to memory. And so we wanted to see in the first study I'm going to show you if we could see where in the brain these different processes were happening. And so the first study involved a longitudinal study where children came in and did these kinds of harder math problems or easier math problems. Children were about 8 years old, so these were still somewhat challenging. And we also measured which strategy they were using, a counting strategy or a retrieval strategy. And behaviorally, we saw that there was a major increase in the amount of retrieval that they were using for these harder problems and a decrease in the amount of counting strategies when we looked at children when they were 8 versus when they were 9. So, what did we see in the brain? Well, we saw that if we looked over the entire brain, we're looking for at the brain now kind of cut through like this, that this hippocampus area is more active at time 2 than at time 1. And you can see here each individual person and then the average, and almost everyone is showing an increase. So this is really good evidence that as children get better at retrieving, they're also using the hippocampus. But we don't actually know if the educational experiences of these children led them to these brain changes. And in the United States, children receive very different kinds of education in different settings, and we can't really say, these children were in second grade, they were practicing their math facts using this textbook. We don't have that information. So instead, we wanted to develop our own a training program, and it was mostly developed for children with math difficulties, but we also gave it to typical children to see what would happen. And this approach is really focused on teaching addition and subtraction math facts and giving children lots of opportunities to practice them. And they got to play fun games where they were had to add together problems and then figure out, for example, who had the larger number. And we compared children who went through this training program to a control group who didn't do the training program, but did do an arithmetic task in the scanner. And what we found was that over the whole brain, again, the only area that came up was this anterior, that means to the front of the brain, hippocampus. This is cut through the same way you just saw, and this is cut through the brain this way. There was an increase in activity for almost everybody. And if we looked at the control group, there was no increase. So now we can say with some confidence that it was their educational experiences that led to this increase in hippocampal activity. So in conclusion of this first part, when typically developing children practice math facts, they shift towards memory retrieval strategies to solve problems, and they increase their use of the hippocampus, a part of the brain that's important for memory. And so we can actually see here how educational experiences are changing the children's brains and how they're solving problems. So now I want to turn to rational numbers, and I wish that I could show you a study where I said, here's what children's brains looks like before they learn about rational numbers, and here's what they look like after. And we're just not at that point yet. But what we're trying to focus on here is just seeing if we can use neuroimaging to understand why rational numbers are so difficult to learn. And the big idea that sort of is the underlying hypothesis for our work is that rational numbers are difficult because prior knowledge about whole numbers interferes with learning about rationals. So things that we've learned about whole numbers make it hard for us to process rationals. And I'll give you an example in a minute. But in order to test this idea, we need to know, how does the brain process whole numbers? How does the brain process rational numbers? And what happens when there's a conflict between what we know about whole numbers and what we're trying to learn about rational numbers? So I'm going to just give you a quick test here. I'm going to present a set of dots, and I'm going to ask you to say which has the larger side, the right or the left. Ordinarily, you would call this out here. Just please think it in your mind. So it's going to come on very rapidly. So hopefully you were able to see that. And even though it was on for a very short amount of time, about half a second, I'm sure you were all able to see that there were more dots over here on the left than on the right. Now we're going to do another one very quickly. I'll give it to you again. Um, and you can see that that one was much more difficult. And it turns out that if you have a lot of dots on both sides, it's hard to tell them apart. And we, in fact, show the same effect if we're comparing numerals. So 8 versus 2 is actually faster to be responded to than 8 versus 7. And so this phenomena is sometimes called the distance effect. And let me show you how it works. So this one was quite easy to compare, and this one was hard. And hopefully you also maybe got a sense of that for numbers. And so we can characterize the difference between these problems in terms of their distance. And we can say that this problem has a distance of 1, and so we would call it a near problem. And this problem has a distance of 5, and so we would call it a far problem. And so if we can see that the brain is working harder for near than far problems, then we have evidence that that part of the brain is processing the magnitude, the size of these numbers. And what we see when we look at this developmentally, in adults, when we look at non-symbolic stimuli, they have more activity for near than far problems in the IPS. This is now looking at the brain kind of cut through like this in that same parietal region we're talking about. If we look at it in children, it's smaller, but we still see that same effect of greater activity for near than far. However, if we look at symbolic comparisons, we also see in adults greater activity for near than far, but in children, we see no difference. So it's as if this part of the brain that processes magnitude hasn't yet begun to do so for children. And that tells us that with learning, the parietal lobe comes to respond to the magnitude of whole number symbols. When, of course, we're born, these are just squiggles and they don't mean anything to us. But over learning and instruction and practice, now our brains come to have the same sort of activity for dots and their magnitudes as for symbols. So for rational numbers, we've looked at this and we can actually start to see that the brain is also processing rational number magnitude in these same parietal regions. So for non-symbolic, we're going to be looking at things like pie charts and lines, but also sometimes people do comparisons of proportion of colored dots. And what we find is in orange and red here are the parts of the brain that are used for whole numbers, and we've got dozens of studies showing that. And we have just 3 studies that have looked at non-symbolic comparison, and they all tend to find activity in these similar parietal regions. And when we're comparing symbolic rational numbers like fractions and decimals, we also see activity. This is the symbolic brain regions in adults. And these, again, we see these individual studies are having activity in the same region. So many of these tasks don't involve interference when we're looking at the rational numbers, but I'd like to show you how we've been looking at it, and we've used decimals. So ordinarily I would show stimuli like this, and this is how we say it in North America, 0.9 and 0.36, but I understand that this format will be easier for you to interpret. And so if I asked you which was larger of these two numbers, you would know that this one is larger, but it might take you a while. And if you ask a child, they might actually say that 0.36 is bigger than 0.9. Now, of course, if I asked you which was larger, 0.3 versus 0.96, that would be very easy. And we do collect that data, but I'm not going to show it to you now because it uses the same knowledge that you already have from whole numbers. So this would be a challenging problem because your whole number knowledge is interfering, but we can make these problems even harder by making them numerically closer. So now we've got 0.4 versus 0.31. These are actually quite similar. Um, and I can even make it further, because if it's not just the number of digits that is making this task hard for you, but the actual numerical values, if in fact you're maybe thinking that you're comparing 4 versus 31, I can make it even harder if I asked you to compare this problem, which you might, instead of thinking of, oh, this is 9 and 0.81, you might think this is 9 versus 81, and that might pull you further towards saying that this smaller decimal number is actually the larger number overall. And so to look at this, we could consider those first two examples I gave you as being near and far in rational number space. So these ones are farther apart, and this one is closer, and this should make it harder. But if we're also processing the numerical values, kind of ignoring that decimal point, then this problem is even harder, because we can now compute how far apart problems are if we ignore the decimal point. And this one is really far apart if you were comparing 9 versus 81. And so it's pulling you even further towards that incorrect answer. And so we consider this one a near problem for whole number distance, but and this one over here is a far problem. So behaviorally, what do we see? Well, if we look at rational distance, we find that indeed people are making more errors for the near problems than the far problems. And they are faster. They take, this is in seconds, they are less than a second for these far problems and over a second for the easy problems. And so now we could ask, what will we see for whole distance? If they're processing the things as if they were just whole numbers, they might show, again, greater errors for near than far. But if it's in fact interfering, then we might expect that this one that's far in whole distance might be the worst. And indeed, that's what we find, that people are very bad at these whole distance far problems. And in terms of reaction time, we actually find no difference. And what this tells us is that if they can get this problem right, it's as if they're ignoring the rational distance. We only look at their performance on correct trials. So when they get it right, they have no difference between near and far problems, although they show it for rational numbers. So you can see here that we're able to contrast brain processing for near and far in rational and brain processing for near and far in whole distance. And so we can ask, in our favorite parietal part of the brain up here, is this part of the brain sensitive to rational or whole distance? And what we found is that it is sensitive to rational distance. These are individual people, and in general, this is brain activity. People have more activity for near than far, as we have seen for children and adults for the non-symbolic, and even for adults for the symbolic. But we also are seeing that they are doing far more activity for these far problems that are pushing them in the other direction. So clearly, there's something going on in the brain, which is a conflict between these two ways of processing it. So we started with this question of, how does the brain process whole numbers? And it's definitely processing the magnitude of those numbers. That's what our distance effects tell us. From that study, from looking at all the other studies of rational numbers and our own study, we know that it's also processing the magnitude of rational numbers. And we're just starting to get a sense that when there's interference from whole numbers, it's also processing that in a magnitude way. So the next steps that we're interested in pursuing is, how does rational number brain activity patterns change with learning? How do different ways of teaching rational numbers lead to different changes in the brain? And you could imagine that the emphasis on just a symbolic way of processing it. It might be different than a non-symbolic effort. And in particular, we could be interested in understanding which kind of instruction produces the most mature pattern of brain activity. And one way that we've thought about this is sort of drawing on the fact that we seem to be processing non-symbolic proportional tasks like pie charts and line lengths in the same parts of the brain that we're processing the symbolic, that maybe if we could increase the uh, representation of symbolic fractions as non-symbolic, we might lead to improvements in learning. So I'll end here just by thanking my co-presenters today, other people in the lab who worked on this, and the participants. Thank you all.